Notice that Sandberg's advice to women includes obviously speaking up and being more assertive about asking for what you want, whether it's a raise or for what's called a stretch assignment, when you ask to be put on a project that will stretch your capabilities in order to demonstrate that you have them, but also finding a mate who will support you in a 50-50 marriage. So whenever I watch this clip, I think to my research, which shows that it's really not that easy for women to speak up and be more assertive about asking for raises, for example, without risking backlash. But at the same time, I have research showing that choosing an egalitarian life partner is the most important decision a woman makes in her lifetime, as we'll see in the next lecture. So on that front, I completely agree with Sheryl Sandberg. So let's explore why that decision is so important using material presented in your text. So maybe you hadn't heard the term the second shift before. It was coined back in the 1980s by a sociologist named Arlie Hochschild. And she coined it to reflect the fact that working women had to come home from working all day to tackle the domestic chores because men were not doing their share. So after performing one job at work, they had to come home and do another job at home, and that's the second shift. Chapter 8 describes how little housework and childcare duties men still take on, and that both genders surprisingly view the arrangement as fair. It has to reach 70-30 before women start complaining. In other words, women have to do 70% of the domestic labor and men just 30 before anybody notices, hey, this might not be fair. And these are for working parents, right? Now, in honor of International Women's Day, the New York Times looked at how much women would have made last year if they earned minimum wage for their unpaid work. What is unpaid work? It's defined by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development as time spent doing routine housework, childcare, tending to the elderly and other relatives, shopping for necessary household goods, and other unpaid activities related to household maintenance. It remains largely invisible to economists, yet its value is staggering. If American women earned minimum wage for the unpaid work they do around the house and caring for relatives, they would have made $1.5 trillion last year. And worldwide, it adds up to 10, almost $11 trillion, more than the worth of all Fortune 500 companies combined. And those companies include megawatt corporations like Apple and Amazon and Walmart. In a movie that I'll show you called The Makers, you'll see that early feminists called attention to this domestic inequality. They didn't call it the second shift, but they could see that it was domestic inequality. And they argued that traditional marriages hugely advantage men. As one woman put it, every man gets a slave on his wedding day. Today, the problem has improved, but it still remains unsolved. In the US, back in 1965, when the government first started keeping track, American women did almost all the unpaid work in the home. Today, working women perform an average of 4 hours of unpaid work per day compared to men's 2 hours. Although the gender gap in unpaid labor has narrowed, women today still perform twice the amount of unpaid work as men, and they're doing it on top of their full-time jobs. That's the second shift. Worldwide, the problem is worse. India has the largest gap. Women there spend almost 6 hours a day managing the home. Indian men spend less than an hour. In Mexico, Turkey, Japan, South Korea, these countries are not that much better. The best countries are Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. They show the smallest gaps, and the reason for it is due to government programs that provide care for children and the elderly. It's not because men have stepped up in those nations. Even so, there's no nation where unpaid labor is shared equally by women and men. So societies rarely take stock of the value of women's unpaid labor unless there's a disruption in supply. On October 24, 1975, nearly all of Icelandic women refused to cook, clean, or look after children for just one day. It brought the whole country to a standstill. Men scrambled to fill in, taking their children to work, and restaurants were overwhelmed by the demand. Even today, women's unpaid labor isn't a part of GDP calculations or other measures of national economic growth. Why? Because it's just assumed that women will perform this work for free as part of their family obligations. Again, every married man gets a free slave. It's only when women don't that society sits up and takes notice, as was the case one day in Iceland. Icelandic women's strike showed that women provide a huge unacknowledged subsidy to the smooth functioning of our economies, which would grind to a halt if women stopped doing this work. So now we begin to see how important benevolent sexism is to the organizational structure of societies. Remember back when I was telling you about ambivalent sexism theory, and I made the comment that so should women stop loving and caring for others? And the answer is no, but we have to question why they're expected to do the lion's share of the loving, right? And the reason is because it's often low-paid work or completely unpaid labor. So that gets us to BS. We call that BS adores and reveres traditional women for making sacrifices for the good of the family. To grasp the size of their sacrifice, it helps to quantify the financial value of their unpaid labor. As I said, a staggering $10.9 trillion more than the combined worth of Fortune 500 companies. Women are half the population, yet the economic worth of their labor is totally invisible, and that alone speaks volumes about their second-class status. Yet it's hard to imagine women taking it seriously enough to universally complain, much less routinely go on strike. And that speaks volumes about how well we indoctrinate girls to expect to perform slave labor when they grow up. Domestic inequality affects women personally through crippled financial power and reduced marital satisfaction. It's a big reason why many wives file for divorce. But it also affects gender equality broadly. As feminists used to say, the personal is political. That has a lot of meanings, but in this context, it means that we actually have research showing that inequality in the home influences how men in the workplace respond to their female colleagues. So this research took a look at husbands at work, comparing husbands who had stay-at-home wives with husbands who had career wives. The researchers were asking, can a domestic traditionalist, i.e. a man married to a stay-at-home wife, also be an organizational egalitarian? And they found that the answer was no. In 4 studies, men married to stay-at-home wives were more biased against female job candidates and female colleagues that they worked with compared with men who were married to career women. Specifically, husbands with stay-at-home wives were more likely to view the presence of women in the workplace unfavorably, perceive that organizations with higher numbers of female employees are operating less smoothly, rate organizations with female leaders as relatively unattractive, and deny qualified female employees opportunities for promotion. So they're like the guy sitting across the desk from that woman in that cartoon I showed you who was thinking about looking forward to her, to introducing her to the glass ceiling, right? So this is a huge problem, right? And one way of thinking about it is that men who are married to career women, they have perhaps more respect for their wives and therefore women in general, but they also probably get a chance to listen to the kinds of challenges that their wives face in the workplace, which then would make them more empathic towards female colleagues in their own organization. So the takeaway message from Dolly Chu's study is that husbands embedded in traditional marriages exhibit attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that undermine female empowerment. Locating this pocket of resistance to gender equality helps to explain its stalled progress. For example, women account for almost half of the labor force and earn more advanced degrees than men. Women have been earning more higher ed degrees than men since about the 1970s, 1980s. So for a very long time, women have had an educational advantage that hasn't translated into equal pay. How bad is it? Women still earn less than men even when they perform the exact same job. So this is true whether you look at actual occupations and the weekly paychecks that men and women earn, which you can see for yourself at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The government has a website, and you have free access to all the data you need to see. And it's also true when researchers run studies, and I'll show you one later on today as an example of it. But even the experiments are particularly compelling because the male and female job applicants or employees have exactly the same credentials. You can control for all of that, and then you can see how much people are willing to pay them, and they almost always pay the men more. So what is it today? The gender pay gap is women make 80 cents for every dollar that men make. And of course, women are still an endangered species at the highest levels of status and financial power, which you might think would explain why they still make 80 cents for every dollar that men make, except for the fact that even as women move into positions like CEO or corporate lawyer, all of these really high-paying jobs for men, they can still be earning quite a bit less than their male counterparts, suggesting that employees simply don't value the labor of women as much as they value the labor of men. So how bad is it at the top? Women are fewer than 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs. They occupy barely 15% of board seats of the Fortune 500 companies, and they make up just 25% of Congress. And that's a leap that we've only had since 2018. So back in 2015, Joshi et al. Did a meta-analysis on research that looked at workers in organizational settings, and what they found was no gender differences in performance evaluations. Men and women were getting the same high praise, or low praise for that matter, for the jobs they were doing. But men were 14 times more likely than women to be rewarded for good performance, and that included higher salary, more bonuses, and a better chance at getting promoted. Author's conclusion: 5 decades after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, academics and policymakers are still asking the question, can women close the gap in performance and rewards in the workplace? The answer to this question from our meta-analysis is women have closed the gap in performance, but not the gap in rewards. Across occupations ranging from bank tellers to accountants, industries ranging from IT to healthcare, and jobs ranging from mundane to challenging, our results show significant sex differences in organizational rewards that can't be explained by men just being better at their jobs than women. Even in highly prestigious occupations, women performed equally but were rewarded significantly lower than men. The meta-analysis did not examine characteristics of decision makers, like who doled out the raises and bonuses in these organizations, but if the power brokers within them are, we might guess, predominantly high-salaried men with a lot of stay-at-home wives, we can marry these two lines of research to conclude that, therefore, when married women choose to opt out, they are damaging not just their own ambitions, but also equal opportunity for other women. That's because when it comes to shaping views on women and work, there's no place like home. So men, if you want to be a champion for gender equality, marry a career woman and do your share of the housework and childcare. And women, if you want to be a champion, then don't opt out, but actually, as Linda Hirschman put it, get to work. Considerable research finds that husbands are more satisfied with their marriages than women. Oh, really? What a surprise. Well, it turns out that the vast majority of working women, 70%, report doing more domestic labor than their husbands. Men agree. They also say that their wives are doing more domestic labor than they are. So there's a lot of agreement about who's carrying the second shift. But of importance, once you statistically account for this gap in who's doing the unpaid labor, then the gender differences in marital satisfaction completely go away. It's like they disappear, suggesting that this unfair second shift that women are burdened with is what's causing women to be less satisfied in their marriages. So it suggests that it's because of the second shift that wives are unhappy in their marriages, and husbands need to be alerted to that. Are there any signs of hope? So Janelle Fedorov was my graduate student. She's now working in Washington, D.C. at Pew Research Center, and she does some amazing stuff about gender worldwide. But while she was working with me, she wanted to study your generation to find out if they have more progressive expectations for their married life. Men and women wrote essays imagining a day in their future life when they have a career and are married with one preschool child. Participants were randomly assigned to the relative income condition. So in your career, imagine you're making, some people were told 70% of the family income, another group was told 50%, and the third group was told, imagine you're making 30% of the family income. Her dependent variable was what percent of the housework and childcare do you expect to do in this future life? Now, what should we expect? If the labor exchange in marriage is fair, then anyone, male or female, making 70% of the family's income should expect to do less than half of the housework, about 30% of the housework, while those making half of the money should anticipate doing half of the housework if the labor exchange in marriage is fair. Only those making 30% of the income should expect to take on the second shift by doing the majority of the housework and childcare. So this slide shows what should happen with no gender differences predicted, provided the labor exchange is fair, something economists like to say all the time, by the way. But here's what we actually found. Women are in orange and guys are in green, and no matter their relative income, men expected to do about 30% of the housework, and women, no matter how much money they were contributing to the family's income, expected to do about 70% of the housework and childcare. So that's remarkable, right? Relative income had no influence on the second shift. Women in all conditions expected to do about 68% of the unpaid labor, and men expected to do about 30%. And that is that unfair ratio, that 70-30 ratio, that both genders perceive as unfair if you look at studies of married couples. But it's an unfairness that will march on if your peers are an accurate lens into the future. So Janelle was upset about this, and we tried to think of how we might push it around. So she said, maybe women just need encouragement to feel entitled to do less domestic work when they make more money. So before they wrote their essays under those same 3 relative income conditions, we had participants read science news articles suggesting either that marriages were experiencing a revolution on the domestic labor front. We told them all about 50-50 marriages and how those were ascendant. They had become culturally popular and were predicted to be not just the wave of the future, but more and more common today. Or they read, nothing has really changed, women are still carrying the second shift. Alas, nothing changed with the data. Women still expected to be stuck with the second shift, and guys were perfectly happy to let them. So in study 3, we surveyed actual married couples and found that wives who made more money than their husbands did less unpaid labor than other wives. Oh, so that was good news. But they still did more than their husbands. Even women who were making all of the money in the home, whose husbands were laid off, for example, for one reason or another, were still doing more unpaid labor than he was. The ratio was about 60-40 for breadwinning wives, who make up actually about 30% of dual earning couples in the United States. So they're not like some small, well, they are a minority, but they're not some tiny pocket of deviance. So why, what's going on? The best predictors of domestic inequality among such couples where women are out earning their husbands, it depended on whether they were the wife or the husband. For wives, it was endorsing traditional gender roles. So wives who believed that it's the women's responsibility to do most of the childcare and most of the housework and shopping and cooking, etc. In fact, that's the lives that they were living. But for husbands, it was definitely male privilege, feeling entitled to be a slacker, right? I'm a guy, I shouldn't have to do any of that women's stuff. We asked about a lot of other variables, like how many kids they had, how old the kids were, how much education they had, and the specific kind of occupation they were in, and none of that had really any effect. So for wives, endorsing traditional gender roles, and for husbands, the sense of male entitlement. And this is important. Even the most optimistic gender scholars, the ones who think that inevitably men and women will reach gender equality, if not this generation, then in the next generation or two, they have to admit that domestic inequality has to be fixed before that will happen. It is such a stubborn boulder on the path to women's progress. One reason why it's such a boulder is because the second shift contributes to burnout, right? Doing it all is frankly exhausting. And then another reason is that people's stereotypes about working moms lead to what's called the maternal wall.